I grew up in the thriving metropolis of Washington, Pennsylvania. The house that my mom and dad, my brother and I lived in, the house that my mother and brother still live in, is located in town, in the city. So when the call to ministry came, it was going to be a change for Betsy and I, because we now moved to the country. And we moved from an apartment in the city to a grand old country house with multiple bedrooms and a wraparound porch and water that smelled like sulfur. Wasn't too long after we moved into this grand old house that I noticed on the kitchen floor and on the floor in the dining room these little black pellets. Now you need to understand that for a city boy, I didn't know what this was. The only critters that lived with my family was our beagle named Missy and a fly here and there. So when I saw these little things, I began to wonder, what in the world are these little black? Sometimes there would be a pile of them, and other times there would be kind of a line of them. I didn't know what these things, I was 21. Not too long after we moved to this grand house in the country, Betsy and I got our first fur baby. She was a beagle mix. We named her Missy after the dog that I grew up with. And I remember one particular evening sitting in the living room, and pretty soon I saw Missy, the puppy, prance in her proudest prance around the corner of the dining room, walking toward my chair, and she had something in her mouth. It was moving. And she pranced up to me in the chair, just as proud as she could be, as if to say, "Look, Daddy, I caught a mouse." And that's when it hit me. I began to understand something about what these little black things were. The little black things were evidence that in this big farmhouse, Betsy and I were not alone. I want you to think with me for a minute about the way that the presence of one thing can point to other things in our lives. The presence of one thing can point to other things in our lives. Let me give you a couple of examples. If the pants you have on, you discover are getting tighter, that's usually evidence that something about your eating habits have changed. One thing can point to another. If you walk into somebody's house and you see in one particular room big bookshelves, and on the bookshelves there are any number of books, but you notice that there's a particular theme going on with some of the books. The books are evidence of a couple things, right? That somebody in the house likes to, and they like to read a particular kind of book. Okay, I'm going to date myself now. Ready? If you look at somebody's album collection. Okay, let's step a little closer to CDs. If you get a chance to look at somebody's Pandora stations, that'll give you a look at the kind of what? Music that a person likes. You with me? One thing points to another thing. If you look at somebody's gallery on their phone, if you look at somebody's pictures on the wall, how many of you still have the photo albums that you actually turn page by page? Okay, a few of us do, okay? Those pictures are all indications, evidences that we belong to somebody and that there are some people who are important in my life. You with me? One thing points to another. I want to share with you a few verses of Scripture this morning, and I'm going to ask that every one of us gets a Bible in front of us. If you're looking on in the Pew Bible, it's on page 1620. If you're using your own Bible, great. If you'd like to use your electronic version, it's the New International Version is what we'll be looking at. Luke chapter 12, and we're going to read 3 verses together. And I'd like everybody to have this in front of them because we're going to read it together, the three of us. Or the three of us, all of us, I should say. I don't know why the three of us came out. 3 verses, crazy. While you're doing that, let me give you some good news. Do you remember that when we put these blue Pew Bibles, some of you might have been here when we put these new Pew Bibles in the pew racks. And we said when we put them in there that what we want you to do is if you don't have a Bible, take one. They are not there to just use on Sunday mornings. They're there if you'd like to take one, take one. We've given away already a case of them. That's really cool. There's a whole bunch of folk that have chosen to take the Bibles. I'll say it again to you. If you need a Bible and don't have one, take it. Because we're going to have to get some more, which is a really good thing. All right, Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 32. Everybody have it? Let's read it together. Ready? Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Read that last one again. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, do you see in that verse the one thing that points to another thing? Did you catch that? Where your treasure is, okay, you guys must have read that backwards. Where your treasure is, there your treasure says something about heart. When we hear the word treasure, we most often think in terms of money. We think in terms of dollar signs, financial resources. Jesus was thinking about a whole lot broader of an image than just money. Treasure for Jesus included money, but it also included other things, time, the talent that we've been given, the experience that we've been able to amass over our lifetime, whether that's 12 years or 50 years. All of those are treasures as Jesus sees them. There's a couple of interesting words here. Treasure in Greek is thesaurus, not thesaurus. A thesaurus is what? It's a book that gives you synonyms, alternate words, okay? Thesaurus in Greek means something that's precious, a precious deposit. How many of you would say that time is precious? Would you say that the talent you have is a precious thing? Okay, you're not quite as willing to go there, but it is. It's a precious thing. Why? Because who gave it? God gave it. It's precious. Would you say that the experience you have in your life is a precious thing? Would you want to go back and relearn all that? I say only if I could take what I know with me. Experience is a precious thing. And yes, the resources we have, financial resources we have, those things are precious. Treasure for Jesus is anything that's precious in somebody's life. Heart in Greek is cardia. Now that might be a little bit more of a familiar word to us, right? Cardia means more in Greek and in Hebrew than just the thing that beats in the center of your heart. Cardia means feeling, the seat of feeling, the place from which feeling starts, impulses, affections, desires. For the Jewish people, heart was a metaphor for the core of one's life. When they wanted to talk about what it is that drives a life, they talk about what's in their heart. So Jesus is saying to you and to me that treasure, the things that we call precious in our lives, say something about what's at the core of us. There's a connection between what we do with the things that we call treasure. Those things say something about what's in our heart, about what's at the core of us. I don't remember who it was in seminary, but somebody in seminary said this: if you want to know really what's important to a person's life, look in two places, their calendar and their checkbook. If you want to know really what's important to a person's life, look in two places, their calendar and their checkbook. That will tell you something about what's at the core of them, what's really important, what's precious in their life. So if that's true, if what Jesus says is true, that treasure, what we do with the treasure, the precious things in our life, somehow shows us or says something about what's really important to us, what's at the core of us, then we have to ask a question this morning. What does what you do with the life resources you have, what does that say about what's really important in your life? What does what you do with the life resources in your life, the things that are precious, what do those things say about what's at the core of who you are, about what's really important to you? I would imagine that if I were to ask you, is God important in your life? Most of us would probably say, yeah. So let me force the question a little further. If that's true, if you would say that God is important in your life, then what does the way you use your time and your talent and your treasure and your experiences, what does that say about how important God it really is in your life? What does it say? See, here's what's happened, I think. I think that somewhere along the line, we have equated believing in God with the fact that God is a priority in our life. We somehow have wedded those and said that I believe in God. If I were to ask you all this morning, is God important to you? And we were to have a conversation about that, somewhere along the line would come out the question, well, I believe. Now, I want to be crystal clear here, so pay attention. For every one of us, if we want God to be active and alive and real and moving and powerful in our lives, for every one of us, there will come a moment of decision. A moment when we've got to decide whether or not what God says about who God is and what God has done in Jesus Christ, there will come a moment when we've got to decide what we believe about that. Are you with me? There is that moment. Jesus says over and over and over and over again in the New Testament, repent and believe. There comes a time when we've got to decide whether or not what God says about what he's done on the cross is true. Whether when Jesus went to the cross, he actually did pay the penalty for my sin. We've got to decide, is that true? We've got to decide whether or not what he did there actually does set us free, actually does forgive us, actually puts us in a better spot, in a right standing with God. We've got to decide that, all of us. There comes that moment when we have to choose to believe that that's true. But I want us to understand, friends, and here's where we've kind of been a little misguided, I think. I want us to understand that that moment of belief is a launch point, not a destination. I want us to understand that the moment of belief is not something that we get to and say, I have arrived. It is a place that we get to and say, now, what's next? Jesus, according to the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, never once did Jesus call that inner circle of people he lived with, those 12 guys, never once did he call them believers. Did you know that? Not one time did Jesus call that group of 12 believers. What did he call them? Disciples. Now that's another Greek word. Manthano is the Greek word there. Manthano means to learn or to be taught. So a disciple is more than just one who believes. A disciple is one who is under the tutelage of a teacher. A teacher is teaching that person what it looks like to live in a particular way, what it actually is to live in a particular way. The teachers model for the students what it is to live that out. Manthano actually means not just to learn, not just to be taught. Manthano means to take on the habits and the lifestyle of the teacher. Jesus says, "You are my disciples." Not just ones who believe. Jesus calls us to believe. That's biblical. But Jesus calls us to more than that. Jesus calls us to follow. Jesus calls us to be disciples. My daughter, my 19-year-old, is learning how to make pies. And she's learning how to make pies from my mother. Why? What is the purpose of my mother teaching my daughter how to make pies? Is it so that she could stand up here in front of you and say, I believe my grandmother can make a pie? No. Is it maybe so she can stand in front of you and say, I believe I can make a pie? Is that the purpose of the teaching? What's the purpose of the teaching? Tradition, okay, I'll go there. What's the real purpose of the teaching? So she can make a pie. You with me? So that she can take what she's learning and actually translate it into crust and pumpkin and apples. I'll see you. You with me? It isn't to be able to say, I believe I can. That's part of it. But the purpose of the teaching is so that she actually can engage in the act of making a pie. Same thing with being a disciple. Jesus says to you and to me, I don't want you to just believe. I want you to live out what you believe. Do you know that Jesus talks as much, if not more, about doing what he says besides hearing it? In fact, Jesus will say, the key to know whether you've really heard what Jesus says is whether you're doing what you've heard. That to be a disciple has a whole lot more to do with doing than with hearing. Look at Matthew 5, 6, and 7 sometime this week. Read those 3 chapters. No clearer picture in the New Testament of what Jesus thought about doing versus hearing than Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Take what I'm telling you and live it out. Live like I'd live. Don't just hear what I say, live like that's what it means to be a disciple. Oh, and by the way, the end of Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 28, there's a section at the end of that chapter that we call the Great Commission. It's when Jesus, after Easter Sunday morning, is about ready to ascend into heaven, and he has gathered those disciples in front of him. And he says this to them, all authority is given to me in earth and in heaven. Now go and make believers. Yeah, he didn't say that. By the way, he didn't say it in any translation. He said, go and make disciples. Go and make people who don't just believe. Go and help people to follow. Go and help people to live out the lifestyle that you've seen in me. Remember, we started with this business of one thing in life points to another. Sisters and brothers, the way we're living out our connection to Jesus Christ, the visible evidence of how we live points to how important Jesus really is in our lives. How we're living is evidence of what we really think and what we really believe about Jesus. Those verses that we read together actually are part of a bigger conversation that Jesus has about greed in Luke chapter 12. The whole piece starts around verse 15 where Jesus says this, "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Then Jesus tells this story. He talks about this guy who had a big number of fields. He was a landowner. In one particular year, this particular landowner, all of his fields produced in amazing abundance, produced a crop that he couldn't even get his mind around or dream about. And that created a problem for the landowner because he didn't have enough storage space for everything that the land had produced. What am I going to do, he says. So he starts to think about it and he says, I know what I'll do. I'll take the resources I have and I'll level all of my barns and I'll build ones big enough to store everything that I have. And then when that's done, I'll be able to sit back and put my feet up and say, soul, you've got it made. Not just for now, but for many, many months to come, you're well taken care of. As the man begins to set the plan in motion, Jesus' story says, God comes to him and says, it's time for your life. Demands the man's life. And Jesus says, now, what good does all that this man has put together, what good is that going to do him now? Because, sisters and brothers, the old cliche is true. You'll never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. You can't take it with you. Jesus concludes that story with these words. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. This is the second church in a row that has been called Christ United Methodist Church. We moved to Erie in 1999. It wasn't too long after we moved there that I was introduced to a little book called The Treasure Principle, written by Randy Alcorn. If you look real close at this book, you will discover that there are teeth marks in this book. Just so that you know, would you agree, Brad? Oh, yeah. There's teeth marks right there in that book. That's because I got this book right after we got a dachshund. And she kind of got hold of this book once. This book over the years has been an important tool to help me stay focused on what my use of life resources really says about what I think about God. The treasure principle, as Randy Alcorn articulates it, is this. You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. He goes to great lengths in here to talk about the fact that what I just said a minute ago, you're not going to pull a U-Haul with you when you go. Remember that guy a few years ago, the one to be buried in his Corvette? Waste of good metal. You can't take it with you. Here's what he says. Whatever treasures we store up on earth will be left behind when we leave. Whatever treasures we store up in heaven will be waiting for us when we arrive. Whatever treasures we store up on earth will be left behind when we leave. Whatever treasures we store up in heaven will be waiting for us when we arrive. And then he uses this image that I just want to wrap this up with this morning. He uses an image about a dot and a line. Our lives here are two phases. One a dot and the other a line extending out from the dot. Do you see the dot? Yes? You see the line extending from it? Our present life on earth is the dot. It begins, it ends, it's brief. But from that dot extends a line that goes on forever. That line is eternity, which Christians, we believe, will spend in heaven. Then Randy says this, right now we're living in the dot. It begins, it ends, it's brief. And then he asks this question, we're living in the dot, but what are we living for? The short-sighted person lives for the dot. The person with perspective lives for the line. The short-sighted person lives for the dot. The person with perspective lives for the line. So, dot or line? Dot or line? And what does what you do with the life resources you have, what would others say you're living for? When they look at how you're using the life resources that you have, what would they say? Are you living for the dot? Or are you living for the line?